Francis Fukuyama's The End of History? Is one of the most widely discussed and controversial works in political philosophy of the late 20th century. Initially presented in a 1989 essay and later expanded into the 1992 book The End of History and the Last Man, Fukuyama argued that liberal democracy, as a political system, had emerged as the final form of human government. His thesis came at a pivotal moment, just as the Cold War was drawing to a close and the world witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union and its communist bloc. This context helped fuel both the enthusiasm and criticism surrounding his ideas. This essay provides a comprehensive overview of Fukuyama's thesis, its intellectual roots, its reception, and the critiques it has faced. The Core Thesis. At the heart of Fukuyama's argument is the notion that history, understood as a teleological process driven by ideological evolution, has culminated in liberal democracy. He was inspired by Hegelian philosophy, particularly the idea that history moves through stages driven by contradictions and their resolutions. In Hegelian terms, history is not just a sequence of events, but a process where human societies move toward greater freedom and self-awareness. Fukuyama combined this Hegelian framework with insights from the 20th century Russian philosopher Alexander Kojève, who interpreted Hegel to suggest that modern liberal democracy represented the end point of this historical dialectic. With the global triumph of Western liberal democracy over fascism in World War II and over communism in the Cold War, Fukuyama believed that there were no longer any viable ideological contenders to challenge liberal democracy's superiority. This does not mean that events cease to happen or that conflicts end. Rather, Fukuyama's end of history refers to the end of large-scale ideological conflicts over the fundamental nature of government. Liberal democracy, according to Fukuyama, has no rival as the best form of government for providing individual freedom and economic prosperity. Intellectual roots. Fukuyama's thesis is rooted in a long tradition of Western political thought. As noted earlier, the primary influence is Hegel, especially as interpreted by Kojève. Hegel believed that history was rational and moved in a purposeful direction toward greater freedom and self-consciousness. Kojève took this further by arguing that the rise of modern democracy and the rule of law represented the fulfillment of the human struggle for recognition, which was a central theme in Hegel's philosophy. The influence of Karl Marx can also be detected, although Fukuyama's conclusions are diametrically opposed to Marx's. Marx saw history as driven by class struggle, with communism being the final stage of history in which a classless society would emerge. While Marx's prediction of communism was discredited by the failure of the Soviet model, Fukuyama substituted liberal democracy as the final form of political organization. In a way, Fukuyama's end of history can be seen as a kind of inversion of Marxist teleology, placing democracy rather than communism at the endpoint, the end of ideological conflict. One of the most significant aspects of Fukuyama's argument is the assertion that ideological evolution has effectively concluded. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, various ideologies, liberalism, fascism, communism, and socialism, competed for dominance. However, by the late 20th century, liberal democracy had outlasted its most significant competitors. The fall of fascism after World War II, combined with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, left liberal democracy without a serious ideological rival. Fukuyama's assertion rested on the idea that liberal democracy could provide the most attractive combination of political and economic systems, particularly when paired with capitalist market economies. In his view, both the economic benefits of capitalism and the political freedoms offered by democracy made liberal democracy the optimal and most stable form of governance. The problem of the last man. A significant part of The End of History and The Last Man deals with the dangers that could arise at the end of history. Borrowing from Nietzsche, Fukuyama discusses the concept of the last man. While liberal democracy may provide stability and prosperity, it could also lead to a complacent and shallow society. Without ideological competition or meaningful struggle, individuals may become satisfied with material comfort and lose sight of higher aspirations. The last man, as Fukuyama describes him, is a person who seeks only security, consumption, and comfort, lacking in ambition or deeper purpose. This aspect of Fukuyama's thesis raises concerns about the future of liberal democracy, even if it is the final form of government. A society of last men may become stagnant and lose the vitality needed to sustain democratic institutions. Fukuyama was concerned that, in the absence of ideological struggle, humans might turn to trivial pursuits, leaving democracy vulnerable to decay from within. Reception and criticism. Fukuyama's thesis sparked a global debate, drawing reactions from intellectuals, political commentators, and world leaders. Some saw his argument as an optimistic affirmation of the triumph of democracy. Others, however, were skeptical or outright hostile to his conclusions. One of the main criticisms is that Fukuyama underestimated the staying power of alternative ideologies and political systems. For example, while Fukuyama declared the victory of liberal democracy, the rise of authoritarian regimes, particularly in Russia and China, challenged the idea that liberal democracy was without serious competitors. Both nations rejected Western-style liberal democracy, instead opting for authoritarian models that combine state control with capitalist economic practices. China, in particular, has demonstrated a form of state capitalism that seems to offer economic success without political liberalization. Additionally, the resurgence of religious fundamentalism, particularly Islamic extremism, has raised questions about whether ideological conflict is truly over. The September 11 attacks and the subsequent rise of groups like ISIS showed that ideological struggles rooted in religion could still challenge the liberal democratic order. Fukuyama himself acknowledged this in subsequent writings, admitting that he may have been too optimistic about the end of ideological conflict. Another critique is that Fukuyama's thesis ignores the economic inequalities produced by liberal capitalism. Critics on the left argue that while liberal democracy may have triumphed, the system it supports has led to vast inequalities, both within and between countries. The rise of populist movements, both on the right and left, in Europe and the United States has been seen by some as evidence that the liberal democratic order is not as stable or universally appealing as Fukuyama suggested. These populist movements, fueled by economic grievances and anti-globalization sentiments, have called into question the sustainability of the current system. Globalization and liberal democracy. The rise of globalization has been another significant factor that Fukuyama could not have fully anticipated. While he argued that liberal democracy was the final form of government, the globalized world economy has exacerbated economic disparities and contributed to political instability. Globalization has created winners and losers, both within countries and between them, and this has led to political backlash in many parts of the world. In many ways, the challenges posed by globalization have given rise to new forms of political conflict. Anti-globalization and nationalist movements, which have gained traction in recent years, have sought to undermine the liberal democratic consensus by rejecting the very principles of free markets and open borders that Fukuyama saw as part of the triumph of liberalism. Francis Fukuyama's The End of History? Remains a thought-provoking and influential work, even as its central thesis has been questioned and challenged. Fukuyama's argument that liberal democracy represents the final form of government, free from serious ideological rivals, has been both praised for its optimism and criticized for its naivety. In a world where authoritarianism, populism, religious extremism, and economic inequality still pose significant threats to liberal democracy, Fukuyama's thesis seems both prophetic and incomplete. While it is true that no coherent ideological alternative to liberal democracy has emerged, the forces that could undermine it remain strong. As we move further into the 21st century, the future of liberal democracy remains an open question, and Fukuyama's work continues to serve as a starting point for discussions about its fate.